further ado, let's get started. Here's a little overview of what we're going to be talking about. We'll look at how infections spread. I mean, this will be very obvious to everyone, but it's just to get everyone on the same page because I think it's important. How vaccines work, history of vaccination, contemporary issues relating to the sort of Jewish perspective on health and protecting other people from danger. So the imperative to remove danger and protect life. What's called Dina de Malchus Adina, so the law of the land being the law that we have to keep, which is why, according to Jewish law, we would have to follow the government guidelines, provided that the government don't do anything that would harm specifically the Jewish community or be targeted at the Jewish community. And then also questions about what goes into a vaccine and sort of more theological questions about, having faith in God. Why do we have to indulge in such medical interventions? If I have pure faith in God, surely God will protect me. And that's going to be an interesting one. And then some of the ethical issues that I've come across in my work with the moral and ethical advisory group to the government. Just one sec, let's just admit a few more people. So we'll look at some of the ethical issues such as herd immunity, the anti-vaxxer movement, and compulsory encouraged vaccination, which is a fascinating ethical conundrum and an ethical issue which we should discuss. And then we'll try to find some conclusions from all of this as well. So without further ado, just comes with a big warning sign. All of these issues are issues that we could spend hours talking about in and of themselves. And unfortunately, we only have around an hour this evening. It may well run over a little bit more because since the first time I gave this talk to Radlett, the talk has sort of expanded slightly, and that was a very full hour. So I think that the best way to run things is that I'm going to speak. This will be a very, very much a lecture. I will go through everything. If you have any questions or you have any points you want to raise, particularly if I get anything wrong from a medical perspective, I know there are a number of eminent medical professionals on the call at the moment. Please do either write in the chat or we'll wait until the end to get some questions and other pointers. I'll give you an opportunity to have your say as well towards the end. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. Okay, here's my introduction. Hope you're not eating anything at the moment or you've eaten already. How do infections spread? Well, we're familiar with this kind of image. The idea that, we've all been going around, certainly a year ago, we didn't really think very much about the fact that when we were going around, we were probably breathing in droplets from other people, either from their speaking or their sneezing, or the fact that these droplets had settled on surfaces that we were then picking up with our hands. That's how viruses spread. A virus is actually very unstable outside the body, and it requires mucus such as this to live and continue to live for a short while until it's found another host to be able to take it in and to assimilate it. So here is my very childish picture of a virus. You'll see why I've drawn it like this in a moment. And we're going to imagine that all of these little viruses are in this cloud, this sneeze cloud from this individual. What of course will happen is that these will eventually go into someone else. Either they'll inhale them, they'll touch something, they'll put it in their mouth, right? We know the drill because we've been practicing social distancing and washing our hands and doing all the things that we've been told to do for so long now. So this is familiar to us. And then what happens is that when they come inside our body, they multiply. And they use the host cells to multiply and to cause a variety of immune responses. The reason that we get sick, that we feel ill, when we get a temperature, when our noses run, it's all our body trying to fight off infection. Okay, but inside our body, we have some wonderful ways of protecting ourselves against all these kinds of pathogens. And one of them is this cell called an antibody. This one I've drawn like a little soldier. I hope you like it because it took me a long time. And on the outside, you can see here, it has these protein receptors. And there are literally hundreds, millions perhaps, of these cells with lots and lots of different receptors looking for various different antigens. It's like having 200 keys in your pocket, trying to find various different antigens in the body, foreign visitors into the body, to try and keep them out of the body, to try and eliminate them. So what happens when one of these little soldier cells, these B lymphocytes, finds a virus such as this one, well, it locks on with these little receptors here, and this guy goes into overdrive. So he's now going to get excited. There you go. That was my version of him getting excited. And he's going to reproduce himself, or herself, of course. Okay? And as a result of that, produce lots more antigens. So as a result, now he's got a whole army where all of these antigens are being produced in order to be able to fight this particular infection. When the right antigens are put into the body, they bind with the viruses, and eventually, if the immune response works properly, they will eventually be able to kill the vaccine. And as they do that, you then get other cells coming in. Here are red berets coming in to eliminate the threat completely. Okay, there you go. That's the graphics for the day. So how do vaccines work? Take protein subunits from the vaccine. So you can take these little spikes and you can inject those into somebody. You can take parts of the active virus, these little spiky bits here, and effectively put them onto a harmless virus, such as this adenovirus, which would give chimpanzees a very, very nasty cold, but us, it's not so bad at all. And that virus then acts as a way of getting these spikes, these proteins on the outside of the virus into the body. And as a result of that, that will then produce an immune response without actually causing any illness. Or you can create what's called vector vaccines, where you take, mRNA vaccines, where you take part of the genetic code from the virus and you insert this into the body. You put this into the body through a vaccine, and as a result, the person themselves then has again an immune response from this this part of the virus that is no longer a threat to the individual. It won't cause a disease. It won't cause a problem with the person themselves. It will just create that immune response that we're looking for. So once you've got this, you then can inject these viruses, either these viruses here that are deactivated in some way, or that they're somehow not going to cause a danger to the person, but they're going to cause an immune response. You inject those into somebody, and here you see the viruses being attacked once again by the antigens, but these viruses pose no threat to the individual, but they produce this immune response. And now that you've got this immune response, your body remembers the fact that you were introduced to the genetic code of the virus. And so when a real virus comes in, when you're exposed naturally to that particular virus, you've already got the defense mechanisms appropriate, and that will be able to kill the virus off, and there'll be no more virus anymore, dead virus. Okay, that's the idea. So vaccines are designed to introduce our bodies in a safe way to the various pathogens that exist out there. So for example, in the case of COVID-19, it's designed to introduce our bodies to the genetic code or the proteins that exist on a COVID-19 coronavirus, and as a result, produce an immune response that we saw before without our body having to get sick. Okay, that's my potted history of vaccines. Sorry, that's my potted analysis of how vaccines work. Now my potted history of vaccines. Okay, this is the really fascinating point where we're going to bring in a lot of Judaism. Okay, smallpox was an infectious disease caused by one of two virus variants, variola major and variola minor. Here is the smallpox virus. Okay, now it goes back a very, very long way. Here is Ramesses V, and he's believed to be one of the first known victims of smallpox. The reason that we think that is if you look carefully on his cheeks over here, you can see pock marks which look very much like the smallpox, the effect of smallpox. And in fact, these same rashes have been found on other mummies as well. And it's thought that the smallpox virus, therefore, dates back at least to the Egyptian period, the Egyptian Empire, around the 3rd century BCE. Okay, so moving on. Here is an image of someone with smallpox. It creates these horrible pustules, as you can see over here. And we have very early writings about it as well, going back to China, for example, in the 4th century CE, and descriptions appearing in India in the 7th century CE. So this is a very, very old virus. It's transmitted only from human to human. And you can see here the work that has been done in trying to understand the spread of smallpox over the last 10,000 years, emanating from, if you look at the blue lines, emanating here from Northern Africa and stretching all over the world. And the reason that it was able to infect so many people so quickly is because at this time we've got people traveling from one place to another in very dirty environments. There was no understanding of germs and infections and things like this during this time. And of course, because civilization is expanding, so too the virus has an opportunity to expand as civilization does, as people explore the world, as people trade over different periods and pass on all of their various wares and go sailing to different places. So eventually this virus is going to spread all over the world. Now, the way that this was treated was quite fascinating. I'm not going to ask you to actually answer the question, but does anyone know what this does? Okay, this rather terrifying looking implement is an instrument that was used for the first treatment of smallpox, which was a treatment called variolation. Variolation was effectively the use of this little instrument to pierce the pustules on someone's smallpox pox that were on their body, and they would take out some of the pus and then inject that under the skin of a patient who had not received the smallpox virus, who'd not been suffering from smallpox. And by scratching the pus under the surface of the skin, the doctors of the time were hoping to create an immune response similar to what we've said before. And by introducing the virus into the body in a sort of abnormal way, the immune response was supposed to help that person defend themselves against smallpox. Now, this kind of activity was carried out in all sorts of places, most importantly, the old barbershops. Now, you may not know this, but the reason that a hairdresser or a barber will have this funny looking bar with red and white stripes on the outside is because barbers used to also be surgeons, barber surgeons. These were the people who were trained to actually perform surgery on people because they were the ones who owned all of the very sharp implements that you would need to do that. The bar itself represents blood and bandages, and the bar is not just a bar to paint blood and bandages onto, it was the bar that people used to hold with their hands as surgery was being performed on them without, of course, anesthetic. This, for example, is a set that was used for bloodletting in the Middle Ages, and until this day, many barbershops have this this sort of bar outside of it. I'm not sure how many people walking past know what it's for or what it represents. Nowadays, they come in red, white, and blue. I'm not sure if that's a sort of patriotic thing, but the fact is, variolation used to take place in these sorts of places, and barber surgeons would visit different places with their implements to perform variolation to try and protect people from smallpox. Now, variolation was not a great method of saving people from smallpox. It did work to an extent, but there is a fascinating article written, or a little book written by Rabbi Avram ben Shlomo Hamburger, who was a contemporary of none other than Chief Rabbi David Tevel Schiff, who's pictured below. Now, not much is known about Rabbi Avram ben Shlomo Hamburger. He wrote this book called Ale Trufa, which means the leaves of healing. And in this book, he tries to rally the Jewish community and the rabbinic leadership to promote variolation, to promote the idea that Jewish people and everyone should have this procedure done, even though it was a very dangerous procedure. And only a very small number of people would in fact die from it, but it was still 1 in 1,000, which relatively speaking is quite a lot compared to modern standards. So Rabbi Hamburger puts this forward to everyone, and he says that everyone should be protected from smallpox because this procedure is going to protect lots of people. It's going to help lots of people from this terrible disease. And interestingly, it's also important to understand that within this book, he talks about the fact that his own children, his own sons, actually died from smallpox itself. So you can imagine a father who is writing this responsa, this halachic position of promoting variolation during that period, during the 1700s. It was also quite a dangerous thing to do because this is George III, and Wright is his son, Prince Octavius, who you might have guessed was his 8th son, right? There's a hint in the title. He died in 1783 at a very tender age because he received variolation. They were trying to protect him against smallpox, and the process of variolation actually killed him, which is very sad. But you can imagine at the time to have a Jew living in London promoting variolation when the king's son has died from it is not a sensible thing, and it's quite a dangerous thing to do. But he felt so passionately about trying to save lives through this rather archaic and sort of draconian method of trying to help people. This is what he did. Now, there is a wonderful episode that follows, because here is a picture of Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz. He died in 1860, and he was an Ashkenazi rabbi, and he wrote a very important commentary on the Mishnah. He wrote many responsa as well, a very well-respected rabbi. Now, why am I bringing him up? Why is he important? I'll tell you why. Look at what he says about variolation. Okay, here it is. He says the following: from this, there seems to me that permission is given to inoculate against smallpox, even though 1 in 1,000 people die from the inoculation. He's talking about variolation. This is before vaccines had come in, before, as we'll get to in a minute, before the actual vaccines came along. He says, nevertheless, if one contracts smallpox naturally, the dangers are far greater. So the Tiferes Yisrael, Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz, is effectively saying, you've got to take a look at the risks involved. Variolation, there is a risk of 1 in 1,000, but if you go uninoculated, if you go out into the wide world without having any protection whatsoever, then you are exposing yourself to the potential of contracting smallpox and certainly facing a very dangerous future and probably death as well. And he goes on, and he says the following: there is clear proof from the words of the Torah, which is Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Asher on Choshen Mishpat, in the name of the Talmud Yerushalmi, that one is obligated to put themselves in a situation of potential but not definitive danger in order to save the life of another person from certain danger. So listen to the calculation. For example, someone who sees another person drowning in a river where it's uncertain that he'll drown if he does not save him, and it's impossible that help will come from anywhere else, if he can save this other person, he has an obligation to put himself in a situation of potential danger. If that is the case, then all the more so, he's permitted to save himself from entering into a situation of potential danger. So what is the Tiferes Yisrael saying? He's saying, you are obligated to save other people if you see them in danger. If you see someone drowning in a river, you have a Torah obligation to go and help that person, even though there is a small risk that you're putting your own life in danger, because the help is not going to come from anywhere else. If it's permitted to do that, then it's certainly permitted to do something that's dangerous, that is there to save your life. So when it comes to variolation, you're not saving other people, you're saving yourself from smallpox. Even though variolation results for certain in 1 in 1,000 people dying because they'll contract smallpox for real and they'll die from smallpox. That was the calculation of the Tiferes Yisrael before any kind of vaccination existed, before these very archaic medieval methods of trying to protect people against smallpox. Okay, let's take another look, because now we've got a wonderful new chapter in this whole story. This, of course, is the English physician and scientist Edward Jenner. To say that he changed the face of humanity would probably be an understatement. And there is a statue to him, I believe, in the Italian Gardens, in Kensington Gardens, if I'm not mistaken. So what did Edward Jenner do? So if you don't know, during the period of smallpox, the basis vaccination began in 1796 when Jenner observed that milkmaids who had contracted cowpox did not show any symptoms of smallpox after variolation. Right, here is a lovely milkmaid. They're working very closely with these cows. Cowpox is a very similar virus, but not exactly the same. And what Jenner realized was that somehow these milkmaids were being protected against contracting smallpox from the process of variolation. The first experiment to test his theory involved a milkmaid called Sarah Nelmers and James Phipps, who was the 9-year-old son of Jenner's gardener. Okay? Now, this was obviously in a time before ethics committees and before hospital boards and things like that. This was really sort of science on the hoof, excuse the pun. Dr. Jenner took material from a cowpox sore on Nelmer's hand and inoculated it into Phipps's arm. Months later, Jenner exposed Phipps a number of times to the variola virus, but Phipps never developed smallpox. Right? So the little boy was the first human to be vaccinated. And of course, the word vaccine comes from the Latin vacca, which is a cow, which is where the whole concept of vaccination comes from. What had Jenner done? He'd taken a virus that was similar, but not exactly the same to smallpox in the cowpox virus, and he'd put it into this child. He'd injected it effectively into this young child, and then exposed him to similar pathogens of smallpox. The child's body had created that immune response that we spoke about before, and was therefore geared up and ready to fight the infection when he was exposed to smallpox in the first place. Now, more experiments followed, and Jenner produced in 1801 this paper. He published a treatise on the origin of vaccine inoculation, in which he summarized his discoveries and expressed hope that the annihilation of the smallpox, the most dreadful scourge on the human species, must be the final result of this practice. However, he was not met with universal adulation. This is a cartoon from that period where you can see quite clearly the strength of feeling against the idea of taking something from a cow and injecting it into a human. This is an image, as you can see, of people being inoculated with the cowpox sort of vaccination, or the Edward Jenner's vaccination. And as you can see, the cartoon is entitled "The Cowpox, or the Wonderful Effects of the New Inoculation." And this was published by the Anti-Vaccine Society in 1802. Drawn by British satirists James Gilray, caricatures are seen at the smallpox and inoculation hospital at St. Pancras, showing cowpox vaccine being administered to frightened young women and cows emerging from various parts of their body. If you look very carefully at the back over here as well, you'll see a little image at the back of the golden calf being worshipped, another reference to the cow. So not everyone was convinced at all. However, let's go back to the Tiferes Yisrael. Look what he writes. We've established that Gentiles have a share in the world to come. And see that even without the holy voice of the rabbis, may their memory be blessed, who told us so, we would know this thing from the perspective of the intellect. For surely the Lord is just in all his ways and kind in all his deeds. And as we see how many of their pious ones, besides that they recognize the author of creation and believe that the Holy Torah is divine, do kindnesses even to the Israelites. And some of them did great good to all of those that come to the world, like the pious Edward Jenner, who invented the vaccine for smallpox, through which many myriads of people have been saved from disease, death, and defects. And Francis Drake, who brought the potato to Europe, which relieved famine several times, and Johannes Gutenberg, who invented the printing press. It's unbelievable what he says. You know, the Jews of the time, the principal halachic authorities at the time recognized the greatness in science. They recognized the fact that hundreds of thousands of people every year were dying from this terrible disease. And here was a glimmer of hope. And in fact, we can see from these data, starting from data from Sweden, going back to 1774, just the profound effect that Edward Jenner had on people being vaccinated with the smallpox vaccine, and being able to survive this terrible scourge. Look what happens just in 1800. These are the number of cases over here on the left-hand side. This is, I think, hundreds of thousands of cases on the left-hand side. And then you can see here as the graph, as you go past 1800, suddenly you don't get these large epidemics, these large spikes of smallpox epidemic. And as the vaccine is rolled out, we now, from 1840, we have data from other European countries as well. And you see here again, the numbers of people, you do get spikes here because, of course, the vaccine, wasn't able to be rolled out across the world as vaccines are today. So there were epidemics, but they would dampen down very quickly. And consequently, the number of people who died from smallpox diminished very, very rapidly. Here's another graph for you. This is the world reported smallpox cases over here, right? You have hundreds of thousands of cases once again on the side. And you can see once again, after 1980 or so, smallpox has effectively been eliminated. This is an image of school children being vaccinated against smallpox in 1962. And in the 1960s itself, before the eradication program had taken effect, more than 500,000 people died every year from the disease. But in country after country, vaccination and isolation programs lowered the rate of infection until the numbers dwindled. This is 3-year-old Rahima Banu from Bangladesh, who was the last person infected with naturally occurring variola major in 1975. And the last naturally occurring case of variola minor was diagnosed in 1977. And in 1980, the World Health Organization certified the global eradication of the disease. There was an isolated outbreak in a research facility in Birmingham Medical School in 1978, but that was an isolated incident of someone who contracted it through an accident that took place in that facility. Banu, Rahima Banu, who was the last person to survive it, she unfortunately was spurred by her community for the fact that she'd sort of contracted smallpox, but she created an income for her family by posing for photographs, such as this one. In an interview in 2009, she said she'd had 4 children after marrying a farmer at the age of 18. She said that villagers and her in-laws treated her poorly because she'd suffered from the disease, which is very sad, but at least that she survived. Okay, what are the contemporary issues that we face, the contemporary Jewish issues specifically? So first of all, we have an imperative to remove danger and protect life. So where does this come from? So we're going to get into some more Jewish sources now. Okay, the Torah says, "Rak yishom elecha u'shmor nafshecha ma'od pen tishkach es hadvarim asher ro'ei einecha ufen yasuru milvavecha kol yemei chayecha v'odatam levanecha v'livnei vanecha." But beware and watch yourself very well, lest you forget the things that your eyes saw, and lest these things depart from your heart all the days of your life. And you shall make them known to your children and to your children's children. Okay, the Kli Yakar on this pasuk, he says, what does it mean? But beware and watch yourself very well, lest you forget. Beware and watch yourself means looking after your body, and doesn't mention the word very as it does when guarding your soul, which requires a person to take extra care, which is why it says that one should guard their soul very well. So what the Kli Yakar is saying is that we should be very careful when it comes to spiritual matters, but that doesn't mean that we don't have to be careful when it comes to protecting ourselves from physical threats as well. Physical threats are just as much of a threat, and we should be careful of those too. So we have to protect ourselves from any physical threats that exist. The Be'er Hagola on Choshen Mishpat, which is a halachic text, says, it appears to me that the Torah warned us to guard ourselves from harm because Hashem created the universe in his loving kindness for the benefit of those whom he created, that they should recognize his greatness and serve him by keeping his mitzvot and his Torah. If one endangers himself, it is as if he disdains his creator's wish and neither wants to serve him nor receive his rewards. There is no greater blasphemous disdain than this. Sefer Hasidim says one should not put a stumbling block in front of the blind. Someone who is suffering from an infectious dermatological disease should not bathe in the same bathhouse with others unless they inform them. For it states, you shall love your fellow human as yourself, and do not stand idly by the blood of your fellow. So here we have in the Sefer Hasidim the source for social distancing, for being mindful of the fact that if you know that you are contagious, if you know that you're suffering from a particular illness that could be passed on to someone else, you could be infectious, you should inform others, you should distance from them, you should ensure that other people are not going to be infected by whatever it is that you have. And similarly, in a situation of pandemic, where there is a risk of being infectious, because we of course understand that we have the idea of asymptomatic transmission, that you can feel no symptoms whatsoever and still be infectious, that one should practice social distancing and adhere to government guidelines, because that is going to protect other people. Dina de Malchus Dina. So this means the law of the land is our law. Under normal circumstances, we have a law that says that when you have a government, which is a democratic government, which is not there to target Jews, which is not, for example, carrying out unfair taxation against Jews in particular, but there's unfair taxation for everyone, or perhaps it's fair, that's another debate we can have. We are obligated to follow the law of the land according to halakha. So Rav Hershel Schachter argues that when the government mandates vaccination, the principle of Dina de Malchus Dina obligates it. If a democratic government ultimately legislates that a COVID-19 vaccination is safe for the general public or specific populations, people must comply with this ruling. Jews who refuse to abide by government mandated vaccination endanger all of society and cause chilul Hashem, which means a desecration of God's name. The recent measles outbreak in Hasidic communities in the United States, with low vaccination rates and the subsequent public disgust with ultra-Orthodox Jews, illustrate the potential for desecrating God's name when Jews defy normative practice and legal requirements. So Rav Hershel Schachter is not even saying that we have to follow social distancing rules. That goes without saying. He says if a government mandated that we should receive a vaccine, then we should absolutely take the vaccine. We don't have a choice in the matter. What goes into a vaccine? Are we even allowed to receive a vaccine? Let's have a look. Now, for some vaccines, there is an active ingredient that is grown in laboratories on cultures that contain human cells. So the reason for this is we're probably familiar with images of bacteria growing in petri dishes. But as I said at the beginning, viruses are very unstable outside the human body. They need human cells to grow in. And in order to be able to process those viruses to create effective vaccines, they have to be grown in human cells. Now, the human cell lines that are used come from aborted fetuses. Now, these are fetuses were aborted, as I said, in the 1960s. And my understanding is that the fetuses that were aborted for very profound reasons, very good reasons, which is that in one case in particular, the mother of this particular fetus suffered from severe psychiatric distress and psychiatric disorders, and the prolonging the pregnancy or continuing with the pregnancy to term would have caused potentially a catastrophic breakdown, and therefore it was decided at the time that it was in the mother's best interest to abort the fetus. Now, in halakha, the halakha is very strict when it comes to abortion. However, under those kinds of circumstances, particularly when there is a threat to the mother, whether it's a direct medical threat or whether it's a threat because of the threat to the mother's mental health, then halakha would look at that situation as to be lenient, to be able to allow abortion under those circumstances to protect the life of the mother. So we wouldn't have a strong opposition to the idea of abortion under these circumstances. And so the ethical use of these cells doesn't pose a particular problem. Even if that abortion had taken place under different circumstances, and perhaps we would have had more of an issue with it, once the fetus has been aborted, the idea of being able to use those cells for something positive, such as growing a virus in order to be able to create a vaccine from that virus, seems to me to be something that halakha would permit. There are other faith traditions that have a significant problem with this, in particular the Catholics, because they have such a strong position on abortion. They have had in the past a strong opposition to vaccinations that have been produced from using human cell strains. However, they have come out recently and said that even if vaccinations were produced in this manner, because no fetal cells actually end up in the vaccine itself, they wouldn't have a problem with the vaccine being used. Okay, the other problem that we might have is that of porcine gelatin being used, gelatin derived from pigs. So gelatin derived from pigs is used in some live vaccines as a stabilizer to protect live viruses against the effects of temperature. Gelatin in vaccines is highly purified, and it's also hydrolyzed, so it's broken down by water. So it's different from the natural gelatin used in foods that we would not allow, even though there are, dare I say it, I probably shouldn't say it publicly, there are lenient opinions when it comes even to porcine gelatin in food. We don't hold by those opinions, but gelatin itself is something that's been processed so much, it has no resemblance of pig, even though it's been derived from a particular animal. In reality, we don't follow that opinion when it comes to food, but when it comes to vaccines, it's very different. First of all, in the COVID vaccines, if you look on the NHS website and you look on the government website, it says very clearly that there is no trace of any animal product in the vaccines whatsoever. This is because not only do we have potentially a problem with porcine gelatin, Muslims do as well, but also other groups such as vegans have a problem with using animal products to produce any medications or any vaccinations. So these vaccines have been produced without it, but even if they were used, we would still not have a problem with this for a number of reasons. Okay, I may cover it later on, I forget, but I'll mention it now. In terms of the laws of kashrut, the laws of what we're allowed to eat and what we're not allowed to eat, there are two basic principles. Number one, in order for something to be prohibited, it has to be food. And number two, it has to be eaten in the way that we would normally eat something. So any medication or implant or vaccine that is derived from animals is permitted on the grounds that it's not food and we're not eating it. So heart valves made from pig, right? Absolutely permitted. Vaccines made with porcine gelatin, absolutely permitted. Medications that contain gel caps that are made from gelatin, permitted, although it would be better to have medications without those if they are available. If they're not available, permitted, because the medication is not food, and when you swallow it, you're not eating it, you're swallowing it as a medication. So under those circumstances, we don't have a problem with porcine gelatin whatsoever. Unfortunately, when it comes to Haribo, we do have a problem with it, okay? Unless you can define Haribo in some medical terms and swallow it whole. Otherwise, you have a problem. This psak, this idea, this halachic decision was given over by Rabbi Chaim Ozer Grzinski in his book called the Achiezer. He was a posek, a halachic authority in Lithuania, died in 1940. Here he is conversing with Rabbi Shimon Shkop, another great luminary of that time. So I'm not going to bring you the text inside, but that was his position. Okay, what about having faith in God? You know, there is a position that we could take to say, well, look, Rabbi, you know, at the end of the day, I get it. The science is good. Rabbis talked about vaccines in the past. We should all get vaccinated. But I'm a very religious Jew. I have a very good relationship with God. And I believe that if he wants me to get sick, I'll get sick anyway. You know, if it's not the COVID, then it'll be, I'll get run over by a bus. If my time comes, my time comes. You know, we're all fatalists, right? If God wants me to be protected, then I'll be protected. If he doesn't, I won't be. Why do I have to have a vaccine? I don't like needles and, you know, I don't really need it anyway. Okay. So let's have a look to see if this position is correct. The Psalms says as following. In Tehillim it says, Shema P'sayim Hashem, Deloisi V'li Yoshia. The Lord protects the simple. When I was poor, he saved me. Now this verse is often quoted by people, usually the first half of the verse. Shema P'sayim Hashem. That will be the answer to the question. You should get vaccinated. You should protect yourself. Oh, Shema P'sayim Hashem. Hashem looks after the simple, right? If I go through life and I say Hashem is going to protect me, I have simple faith. I'm a simple Jew, but I'm very religious, and God will look after me, right? This is what's often quoted. Says Rabbi Bleich, Rabbi J. David Bleich, who's a Rosh Yeshiva in Yeshiva University, says that principle reflects the notion that dangers that are both remote and also assumed by most people as a matter of course do not rise to the threshold of danger of which halacha takes cognizance. In other words, this verse is referring to people taking risks that other people take all of the time. And this is where I get on my soapbox and have a good old rant about the problem that we have in society, which is that people have a very poor understanding of risk. When you wake up in the morning and get out of bed, there are risks associated with activities like that. There are risks associated with crossing the road, with getting into a car. My goodness, that's a very dangerous activity, certainly in some countries. There are risks associated with going on holiday. There are risks associated with everything that you do. And it's all about the relative risk that we're willing to take in order to be able to live our lives. If we were to protect ourselves from risk 100%, we wouldn't leave our houses, we wouldn't leave our bedrooms, we wouldn't do anything that poses any kind of risk whatsoever, but we wouldn't be able to live at the same time either. So Shomer Pesayim Hashem means that when you're living a normal life and taking normal risks, such as getting up, eating food, drinking, going out in your car, going on trips, going on holidays, God protects us when we have simple faith that, if I'm doing the best that I can to mitigate against those risks, then God will look after me. And if something happens to me, then that's because God willed it to happen. If I get on an airplane and I've gone through all the safety checks and Rahman al-Islam, something happens to the airplane and something happens to me, then that was because Hashem willed it. But if I cross the road with my eyes shut because I think, Shomer Pesayim Hashem, the cars will just avoid me. And there are plenty of people who cross the road in central London like that. And sometimes the cars do avoid them. That's not an application or correct application of Shomer Pesayim Hashem. If you take risks that other people wouldn't take, if you go beyond the threshold of what's a normal risk, then you are doing something that God would deem to be wrong. You're relying on miracles, and that is wrong. Okay? What are the risks? So let's have a look. As we said before, the risks of contracting smallpox compared to variolation, 1 in 1,000 died from variolation, whereas 3 in 10 died from smallpox contracted naturally. That was the assessment that Tiferes Yisrael made right at the beginning when he said everyone should be variolated, everyone should be inoculated against smallpox using this variolation method. That's why Rabbi Amberger and Chief Rabbi Schiff put out this document to say that we should be rallying people around to get them inoculated against smallpox even before Edward Jenner came up with his idea of the vaccine. Because look at the relative risks. Variolation seems like a very dangerous activity. 1 in 1,000 people die from variolation, but compared to contracting smallpox naturally, where 3 in 10 died, okay, the relative risk would say, do the variolation, get inoculated, because you've got more chance of saving yourself that way than you do just by simply going out and hoping for the best. So the risks of COVID-19 as of the 15th of November, okay, which is a little bit old now, 51,766 people died from COVID-19 in the UK. 1.34 million have tested positive. That's a 3.9% mortality rate. Given our population of 66.65 million, only 2% of the population have tested positive, although an estimated 5.6% of people would have tested positive for antibodies on a blood test in September, right, suggesting that they had had the infection in the past. That's that the numbers are a bit skewed because we didn't test as many people as probably had COVID-19. So looking at the risks over there, the risk of contracting the virus is still relatively high. The risk of dying from vaccination, we're talking now, forget 1 in 1,000, we're talking about 1 in millions. There are very, very few cases of people dying from being vaccinated, and particularly as technology has advanced, the way that we vaccinate people now, the vaccines themselves, the checks and balances that have taken place are there to protect us and mitigate against any of those risks. People often say, and this will come up later on as well, people often say, well, this vaccination has been, rushed through. All of the processes have been rushed. If you think about the fact that it took, 10 years to make a flu vaccine in the past, the COVID-19 vaccines, can't be safe because they've rushed their work. So there are 2 answers to that. Number one, the fact is that biomedical scientists were involved in lots of different projects before the pandemic, and vaccination was one of them. And producing vaccines for various different things was taking place all over the place, right? But the fact is, as soon as the pandemic struck, everyone was doing only that. They were only looking to find a COVID-19 vaccine. Apart from anything else, apart from the fact that they were going to save millions of lives potentially, there was an enormous economic impetus to find a vaccine, right? And the fact is that the drug companies focused all of their attention on research and development for a vaccine, because that's what the world needed, and that's what was going to make the big bucks. So that's all they've been doing this time. Secondly, the real delays in producing vaccines often come from the various bureaucratic hoops that you have to jump through in order to get a vaccine approved legally. Those kinds of things have been sped up, and so therefore the vaccinations are safe. It's just that the red tape has been cut down, and as a result, we now have, Baruch Hashem, the first day where the vaccine has been rolled out in this country. Okay, risks of receiving a new vaccine against COVID-19. This was published very recently in Tradition Online. You can find the article for yourself. Look what Rav Herschel Schachter says again. He says, Rav Herschel Schachter stated that if the adverse reaction risk for a given vaccine was in the range of 1 in a million, the concept of Batla Data Eitzel Kol Adam would be applied to mitigate an individual's fear, which might have prevented him from being vaccinated. Batla Data Eitzel Kol Adam means that even though you have a concern, right, your das, your mind is nullified against everyone else, because at the end of the day, your concern of that risk, that 1 in a million risk, is basically zero. It's basically nothing. Okay, there is a risk, but a 1 in a million risk is significantly less risky than most of the activities that we do every single day. Delaying vaccination even one day will exact a high cost in human life. Although the daily death toll from COVID-19 is climbing in many countries, the true cost to human life of each day that the pandemic continues is immeasurable, and probably far greater than this, due to excess mortality from non-COVID-19 illness, caused by delays in medical care from fear of infection and overburdened healthcare system, economic hardship, unemployment, and the deterioration of mental health. We've got to look at the bigger picture. We've got to look at the fact that the coronavirus pandemic has not just caused death as a result of the coronavirus itself, it's caused death as a result of auxiliary issues that people haven't been able to have treated, and it's also caused a cataclysmic set of consequences for other people, both economic, in terms of mental health, in terms of the education of children, in terms of just the basic way that we live our lives and the effects that it's had on everyone. And so that, to Rav Herschel Schachter, is a reason to roll out vaccines as soon as possible. What are some of the ethical issues that we face with vaccination? Okay, the idea of herd immunity is a fascinating idea. Okay, this is slightly out of date, and I'll explain why in a minute, but you may have heard of the concept of herd immunity. So I'm sure you have. So here's a simple diagram to explain what herd immunity is. Effectively, it means that we need a certain threshold of people, around 70% of the population, of any given population, to be immune to the virus in order to protect others. Because if, in general, society is immune from the virus and is not able to transmit a particular disease, then those people who are not immune, either because they've not had the virus or because they're unable to be vaccinated, are effectively protected on account of the fact that other people are not able to transmit the virus. Okay? Now, if a vaccine can stop someone from transmitting disease to others, there comes an ethical question which we'll sort of touch on soon as well with the anti-vax movement. If I decide that even though I could receive a vaccine, but I decide that for whatever reason I don't want to, and because of herd immunity, I'm going to be protected, then I have made a moral choice to do that, which is that moral choice is I am piggybacking off other people's choice or other people's sense of duty to be vaccinated in order to protect myself. my safety is coming about as a result of other people making a choice that I wasn't willing to make. And there is a significant moral question to be asked on those people who say, well, you know, if everyone gets vaccinated, you know, it's a waste because only 70% of people need to be immune, and then we have herd immunity, and then I'll be fine. Well, that's true, but you're relying on others to be immune. So therefore, you're being selfish. So it's a selfish position to take. Okay, as you'll see, that's slightly out of date with some of the information we now have about the vaccines. We'll touch on that very shortly, though. I want to just indulge a little time in the anti-vaxxer movement, which, by the way, is incredibly dangerous. It's also something that very regrettably has infiltrated many parts of the Jewish community. Okay, so I'm going to show you some images, and I apologize if it gets your blood pressure rising or your pulse going faster. A lot of these messages, my faith is in God, not pharma. If it's mandated, we're not free. My body, my choice, my rights, etc., etc. If you look carefully, all of these messages are about the individual, and they're all about a misplaced trust in other things other than science, whether it's trust in God, which is not a bad thing in and of itself, but as we've said before, trust in God includes trusting science. Right? God mandates that we don't take unnecessary risks. So if science comes along and says, we've got a way of mitigating risk, that's something that God would mandate we do because that's what everyone else is doing, as we saw before. Okay. Similarly, no shots, no school, not true, vaxtruth.org. Medical fascism cannot exist in America, freedom of choice. Okay, a lot of these are about the prospect of governments mandating vaccination. Okay, and we'll touch on this now because it is very important. The fact is that there is very little appetite in this country for any kind of compulsory vaccination program. And that's probably because ethically people feel that it's a little bit dubious. And as we said before, given that most people will be vaccinated and want to be vaccinated, it's likely that it's a battle that the government won't want to fight. The other aspect of this is that it's not the right battle, because the anti-vaxxer movement, although it's very loud and very pernicious, it's also relatively small. The bigger problem that governments have across the world is not so much with people objecting to have a vaccine, it's with the actual ability to roll out vaccination programs, as we've seen from the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine today. It looks like it's all being very successful, but the work that's had to go into being able to roll out that vaccine across the country, the way that, as we've heard, the vaccine has to be stored and the way that it has to be administered, and the fact that people need 2 doses, and just the geographical challenges that exist, the challenges of getting to the right people who are homebound, people who are not able to get out to clinics and so on. Those are the kinds of problems that governments really face, that they have to grapple with. So the problems aren't really people refusing to have the vaccine. The problem is actually getting the vaccines to the right people. Okay. Similarly, we've got other fake news. Vaccines can cause injury and death. Vaccines are made with aborted fetal cells. Vaccine mandates violates bodily autonomy. All of these things are, there's always an element of truth in lies, in fake news. Okay, and the fact is, we do have autonomy over our bodies, but we also have a responsibility to others. And the fact is that vaccine programs, as we've shown, not only benefit us, they benefit the whole of society as well. Choosing to have a vaccine isn't a choice like, choosing to have a cup of tea. It's a choice for societal good. And that if we all do it together, it creates more societal good, which helps others as well. Okay. There's also another side to this, which this report was produced very recently by Lord Mann, who is the independent advisor on anti-Semitism. And I was lucky enough to be sent a copy along with my colleagues. Fascinating little nuggets in this report about the link between the anti-vax movement and anti-Semitism and other conspiracy theories during the COVID-19 pandemic. Here's some of them. Bill Gates will use microchip implants to fight coronavirus. Okay, So the idea that Bill Gates is somehow going to put microchips into the vaccines and have us all microchipped. This is partly because the Bill Gates Foundation, which is one of the most phenomenal organizations in the world, is ensuring that countries that aren't able to afford the vaccine are going to be able to get the vaccine and have access to it, something which we'll touch on later on very shortly. A new badge has been created which will allow you to go back to work, travel in your state, to fly, catch a train or bus, and buy and sell. So the Holocaust imagery being used against the idea of vaccine passports, another thing that we'll touch on very shortly. But also a little bit of humor as well, which I just noticed today. Shortly after 90-year-old Margaret Keenan became the first person in the world to receive a tested and approved COVID vaccine, there were angry scenes in Seattle, USA, as Bill Gates realized he was unable to track her because his laptop had 47 outstanding Windows updates. Okay, so it does create a little bit of humor at the same time. Thank you very much to that guy. Okay, what about making something that's there to provide a societal good, making it compulsory? You know, there have comparisons have been made, for example, to wearing seatbelts, which is compulsory in this country. So should the government make vaccination compulsory? So the Shulchan Aruch, which is the Code of Jewish Law, writes something very interesting. This is talking about a city which is undergoing a pandemic, an epidemic of plague. It says they also wrote to flee from the city when a plague is in the city, and one should leave at the beginning of the plague and not at the end. And all these things are because of the danger, and a person who guards his soul will distance himself from them, and it is prohibited to rely on a miracle in all of these matters. This is a Shulchan Aruch. This is the foundation stone of Jewish law. Rabbi Asher Weiss, citing the Zivchei Tzedek in Yeridea, in an article on this, he recites a commentary on this, and the Tochas Chaim writes that the contemporary equivalent of fleeing the city during a pandemic is vaccination. The Ber Heitev, who's a commentary on Orach Chaim, which is the laws of sort of daily living, writes that people who do not flee the city during a plague are liable for their own fate. In other words, from a Jewish perspective, we are obligated to receive a vaccination if a vaccination is proved to be safe, and if that vaccination is proved to protect us against illness. Okay, vaccine passports. Now, vaccine passports pose their own ethical questions, and this has been a subject that the group that I'm on, the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group, has been discussing significantly. Now, vaccination passports are not new. In fact, they're very old. And the fact is that there's been a lot of hot air about this. The reason that I think this will become a little bit of a red herring is the following piece of information, which, if you don't know it yet, is going to come as a little bit of a disappointment, but I hope that it won't be too much of a disappointment. So far, the evidence appears to be that the COVID vaccines work in order to reduce morbidity and mortality. So in other words, if you've received the coronavirus vaccine, if you were to be exposed to the novel coronavirus, you are less likely to fall seriously ill and die from the infection if you're vaccinated. It does not necessarily mean that you are unable to transmit that infection to someone else. So if you were to receive the vaccine, you're protecting yourself, but that protection may only be to yourself. It may not be to others as well, which might sound disappointing, but the reason that the scientists are saying that is simply because we don't have enough data to actually know whether these vaccinations are going to protect people from being able to transmit, as well as the morbidity and mortality that we've wanted to protect them from in the first place. So the idea of a passport that allows us to do things and gives certain citizens rights that other citizens don't have, which ethically has a whole range of questions related to it, may at this stage be a little bit of a red herring, because the science doesn't quite yet stack up to give people a passport to say, well, you can now go and do X, Y, and Z. The difficulty is going to come from the travel industry, because the travel industry might well demand that you show evidence of being vaccinated in some efforts to control the spread of the virus in aeroplanes and other confined spaces. If that's the case, then the government will have to be able to produce some kind of document or some register of people who've been vaccinated to allow people to travel, because it may well be dependent on other countries as well. That, I think, is something that remains to be seen. And the last issue that I want to talk about, which wasn't on the list before, is vaccine nationalism. This is the idea that that it hasn't been in the media so much, but people do talk about the idea that, you know, we're British, we've got the money for vaccinations, and therefore we should focus all of our efforts on vaccinating our population before we start giving aid to other countries to help them vaccinate their populations, okay? And it is all about money. At the end of the day, drugs companies and research and development groups have to make money somehow. They have to pay the people, the scientists who do the work to make the vaccines. They've got to open research facilities. They've got to put a lot of money in to be able to produce a vaccine. So it makes sense that they're allowed to be paid for the vaccinations. They're not going to give them away for free. But at the same time, if they cost money and they can be very expensive, what about those countries that can't afford them? So we mentioned Bill Gates before about the fact that he is arranging for countries to be able to afford the vaccine. But what about foreign aid? The fact that, you know, we've already cut our foreign aid budget. Surely we should be helping other countries to vaccinate. So there is a moral side of this argument that in the same way that we help poorer countries in other areas, we should be helping them to vaccinate their population. But before we even get onto the moral arguments, there's an epidemiological argument as well. What good is it if we vaccinate our own population, but fail to help poorer countries vaccinate theirs, given the fact that some of our population are going to be visiting other countries and that people from other countries are going to be hopefully visiting our country? You're going to have populations mixing all of the time. We all across the world need everyone to be vaccinated against the scourge of COVID-19 in order to create a much better and fairer society for everyone, not just for us. So vaccine nationalism is not only short-sighted from an ethical perspective, but it's short-sighted from an epidemiological perspective as well. So in conclusion, I'm going to conclude with a little cartoon, which I wrote about for the Shul magazine. Where does this all leave? Because we've spoken about the fact that have some interference. Could everyone just make sure they're muted, please? Thank you very much. We've spoken a lot about science and the wonders of science, and the fact that from a Jewish perspective, we not only accept science, we embrace science, we love science, we venerate scientists such as Edward Jenner as being righteous among the Gentiles, as someone who saved myriads of lives, of bringing wondrous good to the world for generations to come. What about this little cartoon? This is the cartoon of the scientist who's sitting there looking for a solution to COVID-19. Here's the coronavirus on the right-hand side looming down, and all these religious people around him saying, please hurry up. In other words, implying, you know, where are your prayers now? What's religion bringing to the table to help with all of this? It's a great question, but I think you'll know my answer. Now, you'll be aware that Rabbi Sachs was the teacher of myriads of people across the world. He was also someone who I considered to be a Rav, a Rebbe to myself, and it's befitting to end with a quote from him. A civilization that had space for science but not religion might achieve technological prowess, but it would not respect people in their specificity and particularity. It would quickly become inhuman and inhumane. Think of the French Revolution, Stalinist Russia, and Communist China, and you need no further proof. What religion brings to the table is the fact that the ethical basis for the decisions that we make comes from a religious perspective. Humanists will jump up and down and stamp their feet and say that human beings have the capacity to define ethics for themselves. We have the capacity to think of the ethical challenges that lie ahead, but at the same time, there is something lacking from that particular perspective, because at the end of the day, without God, there is no objective morality. The Jewish perspective on all of this is that, yes, there is an imperative to adhere to science, to understand science, to accept science, but we also have to think of the ethical and moral impacts of what we do. The source for all of that comes from God and comes from religion. And even if I was to sit here with a humanist arguing that position, I would say that a humanist's sensitivity to ethics and morality comes from the fact that even they have a soul inside of them, whether they believe it or not, that has some kind of moral compass that directs how we respond to these kinds of tragedies and these difficulties and challenges that the whole of humanity face. So with that in mind, I think religion brings enormous amounts of good to the table. Not only that, but the fact that religious leaders across the world have been employed through various organizations to promote social distancing, to adhere to social distancing rules, to promote vaccination and vaccine programs because of the influence that they have. And also, we've seen the effects of what happens when we close places of worship, when we close down community centers that are there for people to connect with one another. And we've seen the response, particularly from religious groups, in helping those in need during this particular crisis. That's not come from a scientist's perspective. That's come from the perspective of community, of religion, of bringing people together, which is where the word religion comes from, and the fact that religious communities have stepped up to the plate to help those in need during these very difficult times. Okay, I have run slightly over time, but I hope that that gives you a very broad overview of some of the big issues that we face from a Jewish perspective in vaccination. And I hope that as a result, you will have lots of juicy questions for me, which I'm happy to take from you now. If you